Hi, you're listening to The Dive, brought to you by Living Word Press, starting right now. Hi, welcome back to The Dive Q&A. I'm back with Dr. Josh Waldman, Dr. Gary Yates. We're back for another episode of the Canaanite Conquest.
Who is it that keeps wanting to talk about it? It's all Josh's fault.
You guys asked one question, and these guys were like, we'll spend the whole season on it.
This is wholly on me, so I take the blame.
It's a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance.
There it is. I like that word.
It's
That's
a
a
lot
good
of
word.
nuance. So last week we talked about some of the reasons that God kind of ordered the Canaanite conquest. Today I want to talk about, is this conquest truly annihilation?
Yeah, I mean, we even talked about, I think we kind of got into this last episode about, is this hyperbolic language? What's really going on here? And some of that language, you see war language kind of at play here. And, that's used elsewhere in scripture that doesn't necessarily mean that Israel was supposed to completely wipe out this group of people. It's certainly not genocide, because that's not what's motivating the actions at all. But Gary, are there other reasons for thinking, other than just looking at war language and hyperbolic language, that kind of thing? Are there other reasons for thinking this is not just Israel being told to go in and completely wipe out this group of people?
Yeah, and we had even talked about the idea that, in some places they're to drive them out. It's not just about killing them. It's really about removing them and their influence from the land. But I think even the story of Joshua does not present this as something where, our Sunday school perceptions of stories, I've always, it's like the conquest. It's like a it's like a blitzkrieg, and you kind of imagine the tanks going through Poland.
It's pretty good branding, though.
Yeah, and
I'm not gonna lie.
It makes for a more exciting.
It'll preach.
But there's things that kind of subvert that where it's like, hey, we're just going in and wiping everyone out. And I think the first thing is like, as soon as Israel's told to do this, the first thing that happens is that we have the sparing of a Canaanite, Rahab and her family. So already the whole idea that you're supposed to go in and wipe them out before they even do that once, we have God showing mercy to a Canaanite woman. I wonder about the possibility that this is representative of other Canaanites, that if they did adopt faith in Yahweh, or if they did acknowledge the Lord, were they spared as well? She may simply be a representative example of that.
As in, this might be sort of a subtext within the narrative that the possibility was on the table had they responded favorably to the religion of the Israelites.
Yes, and it definitely gets rid of the idea of genocide. But and right after that, you also have the death of this Israelite man who steals, plunder, and violates the rules, Achan. So an Israelite is, committed to destruction like a Canaanite. A Canaanite is spared, and I think there may be other examples of that as well. Even after they take the city of Ai, they go to Shechem, about 30 miles, and there's no indication of any battles that were fought there. And it specifically says in the text that there were foreigners that were there with the Israelites. Making this covenant to God. So I think that's at least a possibility.
Wouldn't it be fair to say, though, when we think about really this topic, we don't necessarily see this kind of exchange militarily when it comes to battles outside the land. That this is a unique sort of circumstance within the land, because we even mentioned this last time about salvation history. They have been promised this land. God is going to use the land for his purposes. So this is sort of a unique instance that isn't necessarily carried over into other military battles and so forth outside of the land.
Yeah, Deuteronomy 20, there's actually two different sets of rules for warfare. The peoples in the land, as they're conquering the land, are to this kind of show them no mercy idea. But war outside the land, there were the offer of surrender, non-combatants were to not be included, and those kinds of things. And as you read through the rest of the Old Testament, there's really only one other example of this, like wipe them out and destroy everyone. And it's the story, with Saul and the Amalekites. And remember, Saul doesn't obey the commandment. He spares the king and the sheep for, political and financial reasons. But that's the only other story where this kind of thing is like show them no mercy and that sort of thing. And even as we work through the rest of the Old Testament, once we get past this generation, there's not this idea, well, we didn't finish it off. We need to go back and let's go kill off the Canaanites or, the inhabitants of the land. It really becomes more of the ideology of we need to get rid of the idols and Canaanite influence and those types of things. And so I think the story of Joshua or even the commandments in Deuteronomy, there's history there, but there's also ideology where this language, I think, is like in an extreme way, make sure that you don't adopt the idolatrous practice. And we know, well, Israel, obviously,
they did.
They failed in a major way. So we're not trying to scrub the violence out of this. I mean, I think there's definitely that aspect of it. But again, there's these things that factor into the story as well.
Yeah, one of the things that just kind of reflecting on this after our last episode, what do other people why does this sort of seem abrasive in our modern reading of the text? Why does this seem so problematic to us? And I think some of it is we kind of live in a pluralistic society where we want to live and let live, and the meek shall inherit the earth and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, we have to assume, as Scripture does, that there is a right side and a wrong side, a wicked side and a good side. And so, God has every right to take these people out. And, at the end of the day, God, if you've got a problem with this, then you'd have to also have a problem, I think, with like the flood,
which is a much bigger, a much bigger issue. Yeah, and I've seen some. I don't know if progressive readings is the best way to label these, but the idea is, well, the Israelites came in on these peaceful, unsuspecting, Canaanites and ambushed them and that sort of thing. But really, the political climate during the time of the conquest, you have all of these Canaanite battling with each other, and I think at times representing the interest of Egypt.
Yeah.
So in some ways, this is kind of a completion of the oppression of the Exodus, and these city states and these kings likely were those that were also oppressing like the rural villages and the unwalled cities. Israel is primarily fighting against kings and these walled cities. Jericho is. There's some reasons why I think that's a unique, situation as well. But there's even a verse in Joshua 11:19. It says that that talks about Joshua deciding to exterminate these kings, and the Lord hardened their hearts, which is the language that's applied to the oppressive Pharaoh, right? So I think they're fighting against these kings, and there's even also in Joshua chapter 11. Where the king of Jerusalem organizes a coalition of kings to fight against Israel. So in some ways, they're fighting really almost a defensive battle there.
Wow.
Anything else there, guys?
Covered a lot of ground. I mean, we're still. It's probably more to say on this topic. I think maybe for our listeners, that would be helpful to say.
Right.
That there's a lot more to be said on this issue, and this is one of the reasons you can't. When people ask the question, you're not going to get just like a quick meme response and expect that to be sufficient. There's a lot on the table to try to unpack this in a way that's satisfying. And even then, you've got to deal with it on a theological level and determine whether or not it's going to be satisfying, and recognize like we're dealing with a fallen, broken world here. Right. It's a fallen and broken world, and we've got to be realistic about what's it going to take in order for Israel to be, sort of established as a nation in this land.
Right.
Yeah, you mentioned two things, and one of them I think maybe even we could discuss in a later episode. It's like this is another example of where God in the Old Testament is meeting the culture where it's at.
Yep.
And you talked about that in slavery when we did the law is meeting the culture where it's at and trying to elevate it. This is a very this is a culture where gods and peoples are involved in warfare and those kinds of things. God is revealing himself in that way, but also showing specific ways that Israel is distinctive.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing in all of this is that, again, the uniqueness of this event. This is not a blueprint for all future generations of the people of God. Like, hey, go out and wipe out your enemies. This was something very unique. And I remember reading Philip Davies, I think is an Old Testament scholar, who would say, well, when you get this war language and God commanding the Israelites to go and destroy their enemies and these kinds of things, you've opened the floodgates to all kinds of violence. I would argue instead that a lot of things about holy war actually put limitations on warfare. Yeah. It's not the Israelite commanders that initiate the idea of war. God is the one who initiates this. You go at God's direction, at God's behest. And so it's not just simply, hey, let's go to war. Now, if this is just propaganda, but if we take this seriously, that God is the one, if God says you're not to take plunder, sort of takes away the motivation and desire to go to war in the first place.
It's true. Yeah, and kind of getting into holy war, and obviously I think maybe we'll leave on that cliffhanger here because we're going to dive into holy war and that idea here in a little bit. But here's what I'm taking away from the episode: onward, Christian soldier. Right? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, we may need to revise that a little bit, but yeah, that's part of this. But yeah, very unique situation, and it's not like where the Bible's encouraging us. Hey, let's go do this the way that Joshua did.
That's good.
Appreciate you guys answering a tough question. And we actually have some fun topics kind of related to this. I think giants and holy war are coming up next. So stay with us, and we're not done with this passage next. Thank you for diving in. We'll see you next week.